Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We're back with Marxism, Socialism, and Communism, episode number 4 today, The Critics, Solzhenitsyn, Mises, and Hayek.
So we've been looking at the history of Marxism as a theory and communism put into practice. We've looked at figures like Lenin and Stalin, and now we get some contemporary criticisms of their regimes, both from the political side, from Solzhenitsyn, and from the side of economics, from Mises and Hayek.
Yes, and if you haven't read Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, I cannot encourage him enough. I encountered his writings first as a grad student here at Hillsdale, and it's incredible. And I actually, if it's okay, I want to read a little excerpt from the Gulag Archipelago. You've probably heard about it, but it'll just give you a little sense of the person of Solzhenitsyn, why communism is so bad, but why there is hope actually in Christianity.
Let's hear it.
Yeah, Solzhenitsyn in the first chapter of the Gulag, interestingly called The Ascent, he's describing essentially the context of what I'm going to read is, why do evil people prosper and good people get punished? Of course, he's describing his experience in the gulags, so that question is very prescient to him. And one of the things that he's responding to is people that say that, we're all guilty and we all get punished for the evil that we've done. One would have to admit that on that basis, those who had been punished even more cruelly than with prison, those shot, burned at the stake, were some sort of super evildoers, and yet the innocent are those who get punished most zealously of all. And what would one have to say about our so evident torturers? He's complaining about the people torturing him, the prison guards. Why does not fate punish them? Why do they prosper? And the only solution to this would be that the meaning of earthly existence lies not, as we have grown used to thinking, in prospering, but in the development of the soul. From that point of view, our torturers have been punished most horribly of all. They are turning into swine. They are departing downward from humanity. From that point of view, punishment is inflicted on those whose development ... holds out hope. So to me, that's, that scene has always resonated with me because, first of all, it goes in accordance with everything that we learned here in our courses. That's Aristotle, the way Aristotle describes that you form your soul in the choices that you make, and these evildoers, the torturers, they are destroying their souls in the actions that they are taking. So they are being punished. They are turning into swine, like he says. At the same time, he says, their development holds out hope. And then in this scene, he goes on to describe how, essentially, this is the scene where Solzhenitsyn describes how he becomes a Christian. There's always that, right? You're always making the wrong choices, but in this case, the prison guards are making the wrong choices and becoming more evil and like swine. But there's always the hope that they can turn and make different decisions, in which case Solzhenitsyn goes on to make a different decision.
That's really interesting because in Plato's Republic, Socrates makes a similar claim to that of Solzhenitsyn and Aristotle, and that is the worst fate is to be unjust and not to be punished because it is so damaging to your soul. But Aristotle and Plato are not going to hold out hope for the redemptive power of Christ, which we know to be a true possibility if we'll accept it. So
that's interesting because Solzhenitsyn actually finishes this chapter, and I don't have that in front of me, but he finishes the chapter actually saying that the prison was a blessing to him because of this, because it led him to the point of looking up to Christ. And so he sees it essentially as a blessing. And so you just mentioned how Plato talks about the lack of punishment.
Sure.
So punishment, in a sense, is good because it leads you to the right place. In extreme circumstances, like he's describing, it's horrible, but we cannot completely discount that there's a role for it.
Well, and we see that Solzhenitsyn took very dire and torturous circumstances and used them for the positive development of his soul. So a lot of credit belongs to him. If you like this type of theme, these types of concepts explained, take our class on totalitarian novels with Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn. Dr. Arnn covers 1984, Brave New World, Darkness at Noon, and That Hideous Strength, 4 novels that help us imagine what a totalitarian regime could be like. It's a perfect complement to this Marxism, Socialism, and Communism course. It helps us develop courage and vigilance as we look at ways that governments can use their power, especially the power of modern technology, to infiltrate every aspect of their citizens' lives, and prepare ourselves to fight those things and have a hopeful demeanor in the face of them. And I'll give you one tidbit, something that Dr. Arnn brings up in this course, Totalitarian Novels, is That Hideous Strength is different from the other 3 books because there's God and hope in it, and the good guys win. And Orwell actually criticized Lewis for cheating, allowing the good guys to topple the regime with supernatural aid. And Lewis correctly instructed Orwell that made his book the most realistic because, of course, God is real. So take our class Totalitarian Novels at hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course.
And now let's turn to episode 4 of Marxism, Socialism, and Communism, The Critics, Solzhenitsyn, Mises, and Hayek.
One of the best ways to understand the practice and theory of life in the Soviet Union is through reading the works of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, who became famous as a dissident, and especially when his 3-volume work, The Gulag Archipelago, appeared in the 1970s.
We didn't know anything about the gulags until Solzhenitsyn started writing about it. So it wasn't until decades after Stalin's passing that the Western world fully discovered the extent of Stalin's brutality.
The Gulag system was the enormous Soviet concentration camp corrective labor system begun by Lenin and perfected and expanded by Stalin. The aim of the Gulag was, above all else, through corrective labor, make the new Soviet man out of people who were deemed to be otherwise unreliable. All of Soviet society was affected by the Gulag. Millions and millions of Russians went through it, and so even if you were never in it, you undoubtedly had family or friends who were.
Stalin took very seriously the idea that socialism needs to transform human nature. And any leftovers of self-interest need to be cleansed out of human nature.
These people, who had experienced on their own hides 24 years of communist happiness, knew by 1941 what as yet no one else in the world knew, that nowhere on the planet, nowhere in history, was there a regime more vicious, more bloodthirsty, and at the same time more cunning and ingenious than the Bolshevik, the self-styled Soviet regime. That no other regime on earth could compare with it, either in the number of those it had done to death, in hardiness, in the range of its ambitions, in its thoroughgoing and unmitigated totalitarianism.
Solzhenitsyn was born in the year of the revolution and was a convinced Marxist. Like most of his peers, had been educated towards belief in Marxism and the goodness of the Soviet Union. And the shattering experience that took him out of that was his arrest while fighting in World War II. And the story behind this is very revealing. He's at the front. He's an artillery battery commander, in this very precarious situation, and was literally arrested by Soviet counterintelligence in the middle of a battle because he had made a joke in a letter about the man with the mustache, you might say, meaning Stalin. Censors picked up on it and had him plucked out in the middle of a battle, and beginning this process, which he describes especially in the Gulag Archipelago, of dehumanization and terror.
You know, Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag archipelago, he begins with a history of our sewage disposal system. And you think about what that means literally, it is that the Soviet regime is consuming its own people and flushing them down the sewage line.
The grueling labor in harsh conditions was preceded by a series of events for your typical prisoner. The first being arrest, followed by interrogation, which probably next to the actual experience of the camp be the worst part of this whole process for the typical person, often involving torture, which could be anything from beatings to sleep deprivation. The goal being to get you to confess to whatever you'd been accused of. And so it wasn't just the breaking of your body through labor later, it's the breaking of your spirit by having to confess to things most likely you've not done, overwhelmingly.
Solzhenitsyn argues that the Gulag system was meant to be, in its way, educational of the public, right? We are going to teach you what it means to be a Soviet person. Completely dedicated to this wonderful future that's coming, but requires now a lot of sacrifice and hard work.
The core experience in Gulag is the brutal work in horrifying conditions with inadequate food. And so every camp you'd have a norm set, how much you have to produce to get the bare minimum of food to live. And it could be breaking a certain amount of rock or cutting down a certain amount of trees or mining a certain amount of ore. This, dehumanizing and often deadly, very high death rate in these camps just from being worked to death. Tiny amounts of food, very low caloric intake of very poor quality food, coupled with very harsh breaking rocks for 10 hours, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Solzhenitsyn's experience in the corrective labor camps is one of going from being a believing Marxist when he's arrested to understanding the brutal and inhumane character of Marxist theory and Soviet practice.
We were made to strip naked, and were shoved into some roofless enclosures made out of planks. Above our heads the stars twinkled. Below our bare feet lay frozen excrement. An enclosure measured 3 square feet. Each held 3 to 4 naked, shivering and frightened men and women. Then these kennelled cages were opened, one after the other, and the naked people were led across the courtyard into a special building where our documents were formulated and our things were searched. The goal of this search was to leave us with rags and to take the good things for themselves. Then thieves shamelessly fleeced these destitute and barely alive people.
There was an academic element and a sentiment among the intellectual elite in the late 1940s that was skeptical of the whole idea that we couldn't get along with the Russians, that they posed some kind of threat to us. And there was a lot of sympathy toward the whole communist ideal.
That is Russia. Size, the largest country in the world.
Even after the Cold War started and the containment policy became U.S. policy in a broad way, there was still a lot of sympathy in the West, in American leadership positions, in academia, in the media, for socialism.
Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago exposed the West for the first time to the lived reality, I think, of the Soviet camps. The fact that, in fact, this was a huge part of life in the Soviet Union, involving millions of people. That it was not just an accidental byproduct, but was to some extent a central part of the Soviet political and economic landscape.
Many people in the West who had been sympathetic to communism could no longer have that sympathy after reading Solzhenitsyn's depiction of Stalinist tyranny.
Each time they brought in the soup, it made us all want to cry. We were ready to cry for fear that the soup would be thin. And when a miracle occurred and the soup was thick, we couldn't believe it and ate it as slowly as possible. But even with thick soup in a warm stomach, there remained a sucking pain. We'd been hungry for too long. All human emotions, love, friendship, envy, concern for one's fellow man, compassion, longing for fame, honesty, had left us with the flesh that had melted from our bodies.
In Solzhenitsyn's writings, you can look at the theory of Marx, but what it results in practice is something very different. And this comes out in various writings of Solzhenitsyn. When he looked at what the Soviet Union really was, it was a war of a particular kind of political order against the Russian people.
I think of Solzhenitsyn as being important because he provided the most memorable account of the whole Soviet prison system and its size, its massive, huge, its character. He was trying to show that this horrific prison system, through which hundreds of thousands, probably several million people died of overwork and of starvation. Right? So in that prison system was not an accidental feature at all of the Soviet system, but rather essential to the Soviet system. And why? Because that goes back to Marx. The idea that in order to bring about the revolution, you have to be absolutely ruthless against its opponents. Marx and Lenin, that was their argument. Party discipline and crush the workers if they oppose you. And what that idea of history or of politics leads to is war between government and the public.
This system either causes you to lose your humanity or to ascend, because ascent or corruption, those are your choices. The dividing line is, in Solzhenitsyn's account, will you do anything to survive, or are there things you won't do because they're wrong? If you'll take a stand on principle, even at the risk of your life, you can ascend. If you'll steal that little bit of bread from the person starving because they're weaker than you, you're descending. But you can ascend if you refuse to cooperate with the regime, even if it means being sent off to a labor camp where you'll most likely die.
And as soon as you have renounced that aim of surviving at any price and gone where the calm and simple people go, then imprisonment begins to transform your former character in an astonishing way. The stones rustle beneath our feet. We are ascending.
The Gulag Archipelago did not achieve its goal of creating socialist man. Solzhenitsyn believed that the kind of socialism that they instituted in the Soviet Union, it was a failure, and it has to be a failure, and it always will be. Because the goal itself, which is the complete abolition of human self-interest, is completely at odds with human nature. And it will always require, at some point, violence or tacit abandonment in order for it to survive.
Looking back, I saw that for my whole conscious life, I had not understood either myself or my strivings. But just as the waves of the sea knock the inexperienced swimmer off his feet and keep tossing him back onto the shore, so also was I painfully tossed back on dry land by the blows of misfortune. And it was only because of this that I was able to travel the path which I had always really wanted to travel. It was granted me to carry away from my prison years on my bent back this essential experience: how a human being becomes evil and how good. And that is why I turn back to the years of my imprisonment and say, sometimes to the astonishment of those about me, "Bless you, prison."
The personal stories of people like Solzhenitsyn, he's not the only one, but he's probably the most famous. But he and others like him had a great impact in putting a human face on these doctrines, where people might say, well, wouldn't it be nice to have a classless society? I mean, maybe we don't want to do that in America, but their goal is basically good, and we should be sympathetic to it. Solzhenitsyn and others writing about Soviet tyranny really showed people what it was like. This is destroying the lives of people you could identify with. It was very powerful in undermining sympathy for the USSR and its allies in the West.
There were writings that elements of the American intellectual community began to look at and think about more seriously, that pointed out the utter failings of communism and really its unworkability as an economic system, but also its brutality as a political system. As these things became more and more known as the 40s led into the 50s and beyond, American opinion more and more, I think, assumed the kind of footing that was suitable to taking a staunch stand against the Soviet Union in the early stages of the Cold War.
Do you believe in our founders' vision for America? That our republic will only survive if we are an educated and informed people who know our rights and duties? Since 1844, Hillsdale College has sought to educate all who wish to learn about these timeless principles of self-government. For more than 50 years, the college has worked to spread that mission by sending Imprimis to millions of Americans. Imprimis features some of the best speeches given at Hillsdale events, and now an audio version of the popular speech digest is available in a new podcast of the same name. And, like the print publication, Imprimis, the podcast, is always free. Listen to the best arguments from speakers such as Chris Rufo, Molly Hemingway, Mark Stein, and Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn, read by Hillsdale students. Subscribe today to listen to Imprimis at podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.
As the writings of Solzhenitsyn and others tore the veil off the conduct of the Soviet regime, exposing the horrors of its practices, two economists reveal the utter futility of its economic theory.
Most proponents of socialism, they initially were actually very supportive of the Soviet experiment. Most of them jumped off board once they started finding out about the level of atrocities that were committed by Stalin. It was hard to find defenders of Stalin by certainly the late 40s, early 50s. And that's where you start seeing the emergence of competing theories of socialism. Socialists, especially in the Western world, start losing faith in the Soviet model and what the Soviet Union is doing, and they start adhering to alternative versions of socialism. There is one man that, in fact, starts pushing back quite strongly, and that is the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. He becomes the most notable voice to start pushing back against those intellectual currents. Mises writes an article in 1920 called Economic Calculation in a Socialist Commonwealth, critiquing socialism, the socialist model of the economy, which was based on government ownership of the means of production, that was doomed to failure. The way he put it is that rational economic calculation under socialism was impossible.
The problem of economic calculation is the fundamental problem of socialism. To prove that economic calculation would be impossible in the socialist community is to prove also that socialism is impracticable. Everything brought forward in favor of socialism during the last 100 years, in thousands of writings and speeches, all the blood which has been spilled by the supporters of socialism cannot make socialism workable. The masses may long for it ever so ardently. Innumerable revolutions and wars may be fought for it. Still, it will never be realized.
All thinkers influenced by Marx, pretty much all socialists, believe that if you get rid of that need to make a profit by putting the means of production into the hands of the government, scarcity disappears. Mises points out that scarcity is unavoidable, and therefore that socialists are not going to be able to deal with that scarcity for one fundamental reason. Without private property rights in resources, it is impossible to have market prices. And in the absence of market prices, people have no idea what the relative scarcities of those capital goods are. So the only thing they can resort to is totally arbitrary uses of those scarce capital goods. We just think people want more of this, and they don't want more of that. But they have no way of knowing whether it's actually something that people want or do not want. As a result of Mises' argument here, he came to the conclusion that this newly emergent socialist country, socialist economy, the first one, he makes a very bold and very certain prediction that there's absolutely no way that Soviet Union will be able to engage in rational economic calculation, and they're going to therefore end up suffering from massive inefficiencies. They will waste all of the available physical capital that they have access to. They will not be able to rebuild most of the physical capital, and economic collapse is the only possible end. Store shelves were usually empty. There was pretty much no variety of any kind of products. Exactly what Mises said would happen is what we started seeing happening in the Soviet Union.
Socialism is not in the least what it pretends to be. It is not the pioneer of a better and finer world, but the spoiler of what thousands of years of civilization have created. It does not build, it destroys. For destruction is the essence of it. It produces nothing. It only consumes what the social order based on private ownership of the means of production has created.
Friedrich Hayek has emerged as Mises' most prominent student. Hayek was greatly influenced by Mises. He was 18 years Mises' junior. It was hearing Mises that turned Hayek from being a socialist into being a proponent of liberty and free markets. When he became a student at University of Vienna, it was actually hearing Mises that completely changed how he looked at the world.
Libertarian economists like von Mises, like Friedrich Hayek, had a great deal of influence, especially in the post-World War II era when the Cold War began, in showing people how economically socialist economics, Marxist economics doesn't make sense and can only be destructive of genuine prosperity and liberty.
What Hayek sets out to do is to more fully flesh out Mises' argument. The claim that these economists were making is that it is no longer necessary to have private ownership of the means of production because we have access to various kinds of mathematical economic models and statistical techniques through which we can simply estimate what those prices would have been. Hayek says it is impossible to collect all of the data that you would need to have and then to make the kinds of calculations that you would need to give you the same kind of information that you get from market prices, which after all are the result of the interactions of millions of people. The only way we know what ought to be done in markets is because we have this continuous market process of competition where entrepreneurs are in continuous state of rivalry against one another, trying to outdo one another by doing something better, by appealing to their customers more effectively. He writes about all examples of socialism that inevitably, if you do not have the possibility of private ownership of capital, it is impossible to have liberty.
The recognition of private property is an essential condition for the prevention of coercion. The recognition of property is clearly the first step in the delimitation of the private sphere, which protects us against coercion, and it has long been recognized that a people averse to the institution of private property is without the first element of freedom.
What he is getting at in The Road to Serfdom, which is ultimately published in 1944, is it's a warning to the Western world that there are many intellectuals, but many regular people as well, that have fallen in thrall to socialist promises, that they can have it all. They can have greater prosperity, equality, as well as all of these liberties that we had become accustomed to in the Western world. Hayek's warning is that this is not possible. He explains that oppression will inevitably take place, that there is no way to avoid it. Once we have the publication of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, we see actual firsthand evidence that the predictions made by Hayek were in fact taking place in the Soviet Union.
The causes of the collapse of the USSR are obviously somewhat complex. One cannot point to any single event. The Soviets were under increasing strategic and military pressure from Washington, the Reagan administration, both with the conventional arms buildup, also the Strategic Defense Initiative had put a lot of pressure on the Soviets to match technological innovation to keep up in the arms race.
All of the contradictions of the socialist system of production were coming to a head.
Modernization of... When Reagan came into the presidency in 1981 and declared that the fate of the Soviet Union would be inevitably to land in the ash heap of history and that Soviet Russia was an evil empire, that brought the Cold War to its final phase, you might say, when the competition ratcheted up to a point where the Russians just couldn't keep up. In the spring of 1985, they got a reformist leader finally in Mikhail Gorbachev. But when he tried to fix things, he found that the house, really, the more you tried to fix it, the more it wanted to fall down. And ultimately, it did.
The Soviet system shows we have a repressive system which maintains itself by tyranny and terror. When you loosen the reins on that, you run the risk of these other elements that people like Solzhenitsyn talk about in human nature. People begin to think for themselves. People begin to wonder why they can't have a better life, more freedom. Above all else, for Solzhenitsyn, you triumph over totalitarianism by resisting lies. His point is Marxism is a vast construct of ideological lies about what it means to be a human being.
Despite the power of Solzhenitsyn's writings and the irrefutable arguments of Mises and Hayek, communists would not be deterred from spreading their ideology across the globe. And before the collapse of the USSR, the loathsome theory had already taken root in a country where revolutionaries had established an even firmer grip.